A warm welcome to everyone. My name is Alex Gómez-Marín, and I'm the director of the Pari Center. And we are really thrilled and blessed to host this very special event in collaboration with Channel McGilchrist, Perspectiva Press, the Scientific and Medical Network, and the Arthur Conan Doyle Center. Today, we will reflect on Iain McGilchrist's book, his magnus opus, The Matter with Things, Our Brains, Our Delusions, and the Unmaking of the World, on the occasion of the first anniversary of its publication. The structure of the session will be the following. We will start with 45 minutes with a 45-minute interview by Jonathan Rowson, the co-founder and director of Perspectiva, followed by a 1-hour conversation with a group of distinguished panelists who Iain will introduce individually later. And we will end this 2-hour event with some Q&A from the audience. So please post your questions in the chat. And at the end, we will select and read a few of them aloud for Iain to answer. So without further ado, I hand it over to you, Jonathan. Please enjoy. Thank you.
Many thanks, Alex, and lovely to see such a full Zoom room, which has many layers behind the one I can see, 500 plus at the moment. It's a testament to Iain's great work and the enthusiasm the recent book has generated. I'm Jonathan Rowson, director of Perspectiva. We sometimes describe Perspectiva as a way of giving social and intellectual permission to reimagine the world from first principles. It's really about a kind of collective spiritual encounter with the precarity of this historical moment and the attempt to find our own individual path through that encounter. And with that in mind, Iain's work, of course, fits beautifully. And we were very, very proud to publish The Matter with Things. Tonight, I'm going to do something a little bit unusual, which is to assume 1 year into this book being published, that the basic thesis that went into the prior book of The Master and His Emissary, which is consolidated and extended in volume 1 of the new book, is taken as a given for my 45 minutes. I'm conscious that we have a panel coming up with neurologists and neuroscientists who will probe more deeply into brain-related issues. But in order to get a focused discussion with Iain, I'm going to focus instead on chapters 20 to 28, which is I think, the particularly original contribution in The Matter with Things. Of course, there's a great deal of new material and new argumentation that's of enormous value in the first volume. But to focus the discussion, I'm also going to ask Iain in a minute to not to overly argue the case of each point developed in each chapter. What I'm really interested in is the morphology and the sort of narrative arc of the second volume, in which Iain moves from beginning with the coincidence of opposites and ends with a sort of vision of the sacred. And he goes through the one and the many, time, flow and movement, space and matter, matter and consciousness, value, purpose, life, and the nature of the cosmos, and then the sense of the sacred. So volume 2 is really a metaphysics. Now, most of you, I'm guessing, want to hear about the hemispheric hypothesis. I'm going to take that as a given tonight, which is not to say you can't ask about it later. And I want to draw attention not just to the hemispheric hypothesis on the one hand, but also what I'm beginning to refer to as the McGilchrist maneuver on the other. And the McGilchrist maneuver I see as a kind of underlying structural form that characterizes the second volume of The Matter with Things. And it's broadly the shift from a sort of either or view of the world, a sort of slicing and dicing, choose A or B, to a kind of both and, no, let's include everything and everything's the same. And Iain's quite keen to say that neither of these are quite true, that actually we need both and either or. And this statement a version of this statement can be discerned in almost every part of volume 2 of the book. Iain refers to it in a more spiritual context when he speaks about we need to get not only non-duality, but the duality of non-duality and duality. And there's several different variants on this theme. And I want to focus on this because in some ways, many people have asked Iain about the sacred, and we could reflect on his theology and his panentheistic view towards the end of the book. But I'm more interested in how he made that argument. For me, the most important chapter, or possibly chapters, of the 2 volumes are chapters 20 and 21, because it's there that he bridges the argument from the hemispheric hypothesis that most of us here will know about the different patterns of attention of the 2 brain hemispheres, how they give rise phenomenologically to different ways of being in the world, how they co-arise and inform each other. And he moves into a more philosophical take on this being this form of perception, these competing modes of attention that co-arise, being a kind of feature of reality as such. He speaks of the first 2 chapters of volume 2 in terms of the processes by which reality come into being. So Iain, that's the setting. That's what I want to explore with you. I really want to understand how you got from chapter 20 to 28. I want to understand, in effect, you present a vision of the cosmos that's not one of dead matter and accidents, but something deeply imbued with time, value, meaning, purpose, the sacred, and more. And I want to sort of begin by allowing you not to restate your argument in volume 1, and to take that as a given for the purposes of these next 40 minutes or so, and focus instead on, if that's the case, how did this argument play out in volume 2?
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. You've set out a not negligible task, which I will try to address best I can. Incidentally, I know it's annoying to be corrected, but just in case anybody thought that I meant the duality of non-duality and duality, I meant the non-duality of non-duality and duality. But no, it's fine. Yes, I think that you're right. That I hadn't really thought about it much, but I think that those first 2 chapters of the final part of the book, part 3, which is the metaphysics, are important. And I think one of the key things that we miss in the world that we now construe for ourselves is the way in which opposites cohere, and the way in which they do so, and the relationship between unity and multiplicity. It sounds rather abstract like that, but it plays itself out in many ways in our lives all around us. So, for example, the simplest example is that we think that opposites are at the far ends of a linear pole, which is very much the sort of imagery that the left hemisphere uses to understand things. But in fact, the problem is that the more you move down towards one of the extremities of this pole, trying to get closer and closer to something that you value, the more you find yourself besieged by the very thing you were trying to get away from. I now think this is what Lewis Carroll, who was an utterly brilliant philosopher, was getting at the beginning of Alice Through the Looking Glass, I think it is, where he has the Red Queen say to Alice, she said, "I'll go there directly." And she said, "If I were you, I wouldn't do that. I'd go in the opposite direction." Because if we were once to see that, as I put it sometimes, every angel has its devil and every devil has its angel. In other words, things that we think are good have their downsides that we're not attending to, and things that we think are bad have their upsides that we should do well to attend to. That would make an important difference to the way we see the world. But I want to say something about the way in which these relate, because exactly of the way in which we now think, it's hard to understand that when one says the coincidence of opposites, this doesn't mean in any way a diminution of their opposition. So the job is to show that they both coincide and are indeed opposites. Yeah. And it's holding the tension, as so often, between 2 things that we conceive of as being incompatible, and not saying, well, it has to be this or it has to be that, but it can't somehow be both of these. Time and again, and certainly throughout part 3, which is the second volume that you're talking about, I imagine, come back to this theme. I think I do in several ways in relation to all the phenomena that you described. And it's this tension of holding the two that is so difficult for us now, because it sounds as though we're saying something that is self-contradictory. And it seems that we're happier being completely wrong and consistent than being thought of as being inconsistent, and showing that there are two things we need to hold together. The image that I use here, somebody's got their not unmuted, so could you mute yourself? Otherwise you get feedback down the line. Thank you. I mean, the image that I often use here is that of Heraclitus is the taut string of the lyre that gives rise to the note, the taut string of the bow that gives rise to the power to fire an arrow. These things pull in opposite directions, but both need to be held. You can't get rid of one or the other.
So yeah, so I wanted to draw attention to what I think might be my favorite line in the whole book. And everyone will have their favorites. But it would hit me like a kind of juggernaut, because you mentioned already about, for every devil there's an angel and vice versa. But you're also very keen, and this is why I began with the McGilchrist maneuver as I describe it, because you say in the book, I think you're referring to William James at the time, but still it's your own language. You speak of the equal necessity but unequal status of spiritual opposites. The equal necessity but unequal status of spiritual opposites. So when you say that every devil is an angel, you're not saying the devil's as good or as important or as significant, but you're saying nonetheless it's there. And that seems to arise figuratively at a kind of structural level, almost isomorphic with the hemispheric hypothesis.
That's a good point. The opposite is necessary and cannot be done away with. Yeah. And yet one of them is greater than the other. I mean, we live in a society where the prejudice is that if there are two things, they simply must be of equal value or importance, but this is not necessarily the case. And in physics, it's clearly not the case. And I think in the realm of philosophy and spirituality, it is not the case. So I had a very interesting conversation with the physicist Geraldine Cox about asymmetry and symmetry, something that people will know I talk about in the book, and I've also talked about in seminars that are online. But the important thing is that asymmetry is more important than symmetry. This was pointed out by Louis Pasteur in the 1870s in relation to life. And it was a point also made by Pierre Curie about 20 years later in relation to the existence of matter at all. That both of them said that symmetry is unimportant, but the existence of asymmetry is absolutely essential to the existence of anything or to the existence of life. And this essential cosmic asymmetry is what is imaged everywhere. And of course, we know in a sense, to bring it down to a relatively simple idea, that it is the initial inequality between antimatter and matter which enables there to have been a cosmos at all. But the point I'm making in asymmetry and symmetry is that asymmetry can embrace and include fruitfully symmetry, but symmetry cannot embrace and include asymmetry. And in the book, I give two, I think, rather beautiful photographs. One of the front of the library, Jefferson's Library at the University of Virginia in the 18th century, Enlightenment building, which is symmetrical and simple and beautiful, and it was based on the Villa La Rotonda, which is actually outside Vicenza, Palladio's masterpiece, which is fundamentally symmetrical, but has wonderful asymmetries within it, which bring the whole thing to life.
Right.
So, and this is also imaged in the great art of, for example, Japan and of other cultures. And there are others that are like this. I think that, for example, and the one that you're probably pointing to here, is that evil and good are not in this sense symmetrical, in that good can embrace the resistance and hatred of evil, but evil cannot embrace the goodness and togetherness of good.
Right, right. And so this is where I wanted to focus on this, because it seems that this kind of structure of something like opposites, principles of resistance, nonetheless mutual and sort of reciprocal relationships happening throughout the cosmos at different levels, having some major moral and spiritual significance about how reality is and how we should potentially live our lives. I wanted to just propose to you how I saw it in terms of this sort of run through, and I'll do it in a very sketchy ways, and you can maybe fill it out. But it's very interesting that you begin with the coincidence of opposites, as if to establish something about why the hemispheric perception, so the hemispheric hypothesis carries on as a sort of underlying, not just a kind of epistemological point, but more a sort of ontological feature of reality. And then you move on to the one and the many. And the purpose of the one and the many, I think, is also the general and the specific. And again, there's a kind of echo of the hemispheric hypothesis, because you're speaking about the right hemisphere perceiving uniqueness as something sort of precious, whereas the left hemisphere tends to reduce down to some generalization. And then you move on through time, and you see time not primarily, but one of the things about time is not only a process view and a sort of view of time as flowing, but time being critical both for individuation and the creative act. And then if you just bear with me for a second, because I'm coming to the question, you then move into flow and movement, which was again a somewhat surprising thing for me when I first read it, that you had set aside so much time for flow. But your point is not that there are things in life that flow, but that life as such is flow. And you argue that in this chapter. And then you move on to space and matter. And it seems the point there is, I mean, I say the point, one of the points to try and tell the story of how these chapters relate is that space gives the perception of depth, crucially. And also there's something about, you say that consciousness is not in space, but it is in time. And that seems to be a rather crucial point for grasping what consciousness is. It's not in space, but it is in time. And then you go on into, theory of consciousness, and then you get to value, purpose, and the sacred. What I really want to ask you is, you set it up beautifully, and you bring together things that people might be surprised by. For example, space and matter have a chapter together, and matter and consciousness, less surprising. But there's a moment between chapter 25 and chapter 26 where you move into value and a kind of teleology, and then the sacred. And around there, I imagine someone who hasn't been paying attention might say he's making the classic Izot fallacy or fact-value distinction. He's moving from a kind of descriptive ontology to some kind of normative view of how the world is. Is your view which one of the following is closer to your view? Is it something like, it's difficult for the right hemisphere to explain something to the left hemisphere when it doesn't want to understand it, and it's just self-evident to the right hemisphere that things are this way, like a mother holding a child is beautiful, is of value, a tree, a sunset, these things are given, they're intrinsic features of the universe, they have value. Is your view that it's just self-evident and something that reveals itself to us? Or is there a way that you can actually mobilize some sort of left hemisphere-like argument to make that case? Or is that kind of missing the point, and it's better just to reveal what is the case? Because you seem to, there's something happens there, Iain, I think, because you get to the sacred and everyone's like, well, not everyone, I know you've had some critical feedback on this, but there's something very beautiful happens around chapter 25 to chapter 26, where you're going from neurology, epistemology, a kind of descriptive ontology, a kind of metaphysics, and then boom, suddenly we're in a world of intrinsic value, meaning and purpose. I want you to talk us through what happens there. How does that shift occur?
Yes. I'm not sure I have actually, or I'm not aware of having received anyway too much criticism about it, but I certainly was advised ahead of time by some people I respect, certainly not to include a chapter on the sacred, because they felt that there was philosophical depth or richness in what I had expounded, and they thought that that would immediately turn some people away and say, oh, well, it's a hopeless case, he's a faith head sort of thing. But I didn't feel happy with an account of what there is that, takes on topics as big as time and space, but doesn't take on the sacred, but also the ideas of value in itself and purpose. I was encouraged by the fact that a colleague of mine at Oxford, Derek Parfit, who was a very famous philosopher, considered one of the greatest of recent decades, who was an atheist, himself believed that values were ontological primitives, that they weren't made up, but that they were, as it were, part of the structure of things. There are a number of things to say about that. I mean, again, I can refer to philosophers, Max Scheler, who made the rather interesting point that value may be rather like our perception of color, that we don't make an assumption and test it out and calculate that this is blue. We see it and then we know it is blue. Yeah. And in German there is a word, Wahrnehmung, which means perception. Right. And he created a word, Wertnehmung, which is valueception. It was like perception. And what we know about the right hemisphere, and this is in part one that I won't go to on your advice for the moment, or just because we don't want to use up too much time on that tonight. There, I think I demonstrate with a colossal amount of evidence that when it comes to things like attending to the world, perceiving them and rightly judging them, the left hemisphere is inferior to the right. So the right hemisphere apprehension that there is value has been taken by the left hemisphere as, well, prove it. It must be of utility. Right. And then you get what seem to me enormously jejune arguments in favor of goodness, beauty, and truth based on the idea that they are useful in some way. Right. And I mean, we haven't got time to go through, that's an hour's talk in itself, and one that I have given actually at Pari. But the point, I think, is that it's manifestly unsatisfactory to anyone who isn't already completely mind closed on this, that these things must show their utility. Even Darwin was completely baffled by beauty. He saw perfectly well that it can be used once you have beauty in order to guide mate selection, but he made the point that seems to have been missed by so many people coming after him, that we haven't any idea where beauty itself comes from. And he returns to this puzzle at least twice, to my knowledge, in the literature. And he talked about beauty an enormous amount. Every other page of The Descent of Man literally has the word beauty or beautiful on it, which is not what you find in his philosophical descendants. So I think these things have been sidetracked and sort of dismissed because they don't fit into the overall utilitarian calculus. Right. And philosophers are embarrassed about that. But they're enormously important. First of all, perhaps the ultimate test of the reality of anything is the appeal to experience. You can argue anything you like, but if in the end it doesn't really square with your experience, that is the final test of any kind of argument towards truth, whatever school you belong to, which is why I myself admire the pragmatists, which effectively are saying something of this kind. Right. But certainly in my experience and the experience of many people that I've got to know, and some of them through my profession as a psychiatrist, I think these things are enormously important, give meaning and seem rich, and are only uncovered if you approach them and are open to them. There are certain things that you will never find if you. It's rather like the image of Simplicius sitting on the bank of the river, learning how to swim before he gets into the water. But you can't learn how to swim until you get into the water. And these things demand, in that sense, an openness to experience that's very important. And they colour so much of the way in which we think about and decide about the courses of action we should follow and the way the world is going. So I think actually covertly people think these things are incredibly important. And people say to me, thank God somebody is at last talking about these values. The other one you mentioned is purpose. And if I can just quickly say about it.
If you don't mind, we'll come on to that in a second. But for those who are wondering, this term valueception, I just want to stick with it. I know you took it from German.
Yes, okay, it's fine.
I believe it first appears on page 1131 because I looked into it prior to the call. It's a mind-blowing concept again, because it's a subversive, transgressive idea in some ways for the world as we find it. Because what you're effectively saying is, just as time and space may be ontological primaries too, and if I try and throw a can in the bin. I have to make judgments about time and space and assume they're real to get it right. But you're saying something similar is the case with value, that there is a kind of intrinsic, implicit grasp that value is already somehow there. And by the way, can you help us here with the elision between value and values, and what might be confused by that elision? But I am keen to hear more about valueception before you come on to purpose.
All right, okay. Well, just to reassure you, valueception does come up in part 1 of the Master and His Emissary as well, so I have given it a fair old airing in the past, but it may well not come up until the chapter on value in The Matter with Things. That sounds about right. On the distinction between value and values, I mean, I'm making this distinction that what we value at any one time in any one place may well vary. So people's values in that sense can be said to be somewhat societally determined. However, by the way, this is grossly overestimated, so that I spend some time showing that actually people from quite different cultures see usually the same things as beautiful or ugly, and make the same judgments about pieces of music and so forth. Generally speaking, have similar ideas about goodness. They may vary on certain ways in which it might be lawful to kill somebody or not. But generally speaking, most people don't think that murder and rape are a good idea, and so on. So that would be the values thing, whereas value is the whole, which comes back to valueception, that we have a faculty which is able to discern these values, and it comes about very quickly. Goethe, as you know, because I make the remark more than once, had this, I think, brilliant idea that something that important in the world gives rise in the individual to the faculty with which it can be properly appreciated. Right. So that, in a way, the growth in us of a faculty is caused by the perception there is something there that we need to contact and be able to assess. Right. And I think this is true of value. It's hardwired into us in that sense now. And infants, even at 3 days, will gravitate to looking at beautiful faces that have been judged to be beautiful, not just in their own culture, but by people in other cultures, faces in other cultures. So there's something quite down to earth and simple, basic about the need for beauty, which guides us towards many things. It's complicated, and I show that truth and goodness and beauty don't always necessarily completely coincide, which is why we have different concepts. Right. Interestingly, Goethe. Yeah, go on.
Well, I'm keen about the end of our time that people have a feeling for the full reach of the second volume.
Sure.
And like I say, at the beginning, chapters 20 and 21, the coincidence of opposites and the one and the many, it feels like a kind of shift from epistemology to ontology, but in a similar kind of structure. And then you move in to describe, a sort of process theory, a sort of theory of time as flowing. You make flow a fundamental feature of reality. You investigate space. You speak about matter as critical for resistance. You get into a theory of consciousness, which is a kind of panpsychism, although with your own caveats there. And there's somewhere around the end of the consciousness chapter where you describe, I think if I'm right, I've got written it down here, if I can read my own handwriting. You say at the end, I believe that what exists is, you speak about a field of potentiality. And that you speak about this field of potentiality as giving rise to the capacity for value, which is kind of the comment you just made, that there's something about the nature of the field of potentiality when you perceive it in a certain way. You see that what it's for, and this brings in the sort of teleological dimension, what it's for is the capacity for value. Because I want people to feel that when you land up on the sacred at the end, you didn't just tag it on, right? It wasn't as if, oh, let's say something about another important question. I very much felt as I was reading the book that I was being led from first principles in neurology, perception, intuition, imagination, reason, through the different institutional faculties of science and so forth, art, etc., to this sort of shift towards ontology and then a shift towards metaphysics. And within that metaphysics, you move from value as fundamental, purpose being baked into the cosmos, and us here as mere human beings somehow in some resonant relationship with reality, in which the point of our being is not to utilize or utility maximization, but something more about rediscovering the sacred relationship that's already there. And I just want to encourage you to sort of, you may not remember because you spent so much time in the details of each of these chapters, but there's something really beautiful that happens in the second volume, in which the sacred is sort of brought into being. So by the time you get to chapter 28, you're already there. There's a sense in which, of course, the sacred. It's not at all that you tacked it on. Is that your impression, or have I just made that up?
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, I think sometimes somebody who's outside the process can see more of what has happened here than the person who's in the middle of it. It doesn't surprise me what you say. In fact, it pleases me. I think one way of talking about this is that the discovery is not simply a linear process, this bringing of something into being. It's not a linear process in which one thing is established and another is added and so on, but it's more like a sort of going backwards and forwards between part and whole, which we actually know is how the right and left hemisphere operate.
Like Blake's ladder or something.
Sorry?
It's a kind of, you mentioned Blake's ladder elsewhere. This
Yes. Well, that's one way of looking at it. It's that, and it's the sort of bringing gradually into focus of something as more and more of it is seen. It doesn't, as it were, change. It contributes to, and you see which way this picture has to be crystallized.
Right.
And so I think that's why in the note to the reader at the outset, I sort of suggest that I hope it will be a bit like a journey, and that's really what you're saying, that you gather things, you see what the implications of this, and it leads in a absolutely reasonable way, a rational way, but not by simple steps of logic, but by a picture that, as it were, comes more and more into focus and becomes richer and richer. And I see the cosmos itself as A.N. Whitehead. Whitehead was a great philosopher, and nobody can say that he, the co-author of the Principia Mathematica with Bertrand Russell, was somehow off on a cloud. I mean, he sees these spiritual realities extremely clearly. Right. And his vision is that whatever the divine force, the logos, the li, the rta, whatever it is that's in the cosmos that creates, is in communion with, or in commerce with, or doing a sort of dance with, a relationship, and in any case with whatever it is that's coming into being. And that coming into being is both informative and creative for that force itself and for what is coming into being. Right. So that force, that perhaps divine, whatever it is coming to know more of its own infinite potential as it is realized and precipitated out in the process of individuation. Right. So there is always this process of individuation and the process of union. And once again, this is an unequal pairing, in that union will always unify the individuation with the integrity of the whole, not render them separate. So it's another instance of that, and that's a theme that comes back again and again. But this, is it better to go to resistance or to go to purpose, or where would you like to go now?
I think I want to go to the sacred, just because I'm conscious we have just over 5, maybe 7 minutes left. All right. Because I think the listeners can now take it as a given that there is this kind of argument unfolds in the second volume that leads up to a take on the sacred, and you described it as panentheistic, and this is a term of art, technical term. Talk me through that, and how does it arise from the prior? I'm particularly interested to understand, because the reason, if we could speak to the motivation behind this question and my decision to focus on this part of the book, I guess I'm also trying to get at whether the other way of viewing the universe, and there's more than one, of course, but the reductionist view that you take issue with right at the start of the book, saying this is kind of your target, this is your enemy, maybe not enemy, but certainly your target, the reductionist view that thinks we're just sort of dead matter in a meaningless cosmos. And you go step by step to explain why that's not really a reasonable view. And your reasonableness takes you, after 600,000 odd words and lots of footnotes, to a view of the sacred that is panentheistic. So I just want to hear your view of what panentheism means to you, and for the listeners to realize that it doesn't come out of nowhere, it comes out of the preceding argument.
Yes, it does. But again, I want to make a very clear distinction that nobody needs to think that they're going to have anything religious rammed down their throat at all, not even in the chapter on the sacred. And I don't really talk about anything religious up until that chapter. I think what you're pointing to there is that I'm unpacking, I think, a richer, more complex, more sophisticated view of the world than that of reductive materialism,
Right.
and that it is in keeping with three very important sets of findings. One that I expound at great length is neuroscience. Another is physics, in which I'm not an expert, but have been advised by a number of physicists who've approached me and said that my work in the Master in His Hemisphere was very interesting to them. And the wisdom traditions, if you like, of both East and West, they reach very similar conclusions. And at the moment, we're seeing a change in philosophy in which panpsychism is enjoying a revival. And even in biology, which is the most recalcitrant and mechanistic of all the branches of science, paradoxically, because it ought not to be, we're seeing changes. So when we come to that chapter, what I'm talking about there is the non-reduction of the idea of the divine to the sum of bits that we're aware of, which would be pantheism. So pantheism is more, if you like, comfortable to the left hemisphere trained mind that says, okay, well, if you want to call this assemblage of bits God, I'm not going to stop you. And I'm saying, no, you've missed the point. There's something much more here, which is not just in this material. And in fact, in a recent talk, I mentioned the way in which music is not just in the sounds. A poem is not just in the words. And a painting is not just in the frescoed wall where it stands. It is something else, which is actually the beginning of an experience. And that experience is an encounter. So it requires something other. And the whole idea of there being something other is essential to my argument. I don't fall into either the unfortunate positions of a naive idealist that it's all just made up by my brain, or a naive realist that actually my brain has nothing to do with the existence of what's out there. So that's a constant theme. But what I'm suggesting is that in panentheism, which means that God is in everything and everything is in God. In other words, God is not exhausted by the sum of all those things, nor is he restricted by his presence in all those things to them being a description of what he is. So it's a bigger and broader, more capacious, more evolving position. And a theologian called Moltmann actually wrote about panentheism as a way of understanding the Trinity, which I think, I won't unpack it here, but I do in the book, which I think is quite interesting. Because, I spent the first 40 years of my life thinking, well, there are a lot of balmy things in religion, but the Trinity's got to be one of the balmiest. As they say, the man, the boy, and the bird. But I now realize so many things that have come to me in the last 20 years, the richness and wisdom of things that I dismissed because I didn't really understand them.
Mm-hmm. So I have more to ask you, as always, Iain, but I think I'm inclined to leave it there. The only thing I wanted to probe you with, and you can choose whether to answer or not, is
we've got a few more minutes, I think.
Yeah, okay. Well, you're a scientist, so if the audience will permit me, it's an interesting tension, because you are a scientist and you've built your reputation on the quality of your scientific inquiry, and your premise about the hemispheric hypothesis is, although it's philosophically informed, it's primarily a sort of scientific case that it builds on. And yet you end this monumental inquiry in a view of the sacred. And so, and you've also mentioned valueception as a kind of key feature of what it is to be human and to understand the argument that you presented. But you're keen not to be religious, So all of that seems to be, not to be advocating religion or to be seen that somehow that's implicit. But I just wonder how easy that is for you, because where is valueception? You mentioned the wisdom traditions. Part of me is feeling like, there might be all sorts of atrocities in religion in the past, and many good reasons not to go hook, line, and sinker into organized religion. Absolutely. We all know that. Nonetheless, is there something about the nature of your argument landing up in the sacred, having come that long journey from the science through the philosophy, that points towards something about what the future of religion has to be, or at least the future of spiritual practice and the institutionalization of that, and the enculturation of that? What does that look like if we're to survive and thrive as a species that looks like it might be foolish enough to destroy its only home?
Well, I don't know what it will look like. I think, as Niels Bohr said, prediction is a difficult thing, especially when it concerns the future. So I think I can honestly say that it's probably a mistake to try and predict, but I can make some remarks in that direction. Hello? Somebody's speaking, I can't hear. Perhaps they didn't mean to be on. What I would say is, first of all, that there is absolutely no necessary divorce between science and philosophy. Exactly the opposite. Science without philosophy is weak, possibly dangerous. And this is a point that was also made by Whitehead, that, their divorce has been a disaster, both for science and for philosophy. So I'm constantly saying to philosophers, but actually you do need to look at the science. And I'm constantly saying to scientists, but you can't just naively assume that what you've got here is a fact that, just is another piece of a datum. We actually have to be able to understand the whole that we're contributing to. But I guess you look like you want to say something.
Yeah, just to be more precise about the question, many of your speeches, as many of the audience here will know, lament the state of the world, and you're often very articulate, but also quite emphatic that this is a world gone wrong, a world in risks destroying itself through its own hubris.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
However, you're quite right not to prophesize what the future will be, and you're also quite right not to have bullet point answers about what we should do. Nonetheless, I do want to push you that you're arguing for the importance of recognizing a different view of reality. You said yourself the key is a new form of perception, and a key aspect of that new perception is the intrinsic value that you've mentioned in this notion of valueception. We need to come to see the beauty and glory and produce gift of the world. However, I'm kind of pushing you on give us some sense of how that manifests, because in the book, in volume 1, you do speak of how the manifestation institutionally of these forms of inquiry, but now you end the book, and I'm wondering how that manifests now, or maybe that's for the next generation to answer, but I'm keen to know your thoughts on
it. Gosh. And one starts having to say rather simple things like we need to change education, which we certainly do. And, I won't go into that because it's kind of dull and lots of people have said it, but we need to rehumanize it. We need to change the nature of public discourse so that we are actively encouraging the values that I'm talking about, the openness to the idea of connection, kindness and love, rather than vilification, narcissism, self-righteousness. We need to shift to one in which we re-understand the awe that we can experience and all have in us to experience if we'll allow ourselves to feel, to experience it before the natural world. All of these things are militated against by various aspects of modern society. I have to take that that people will know why that is the case. But I think that we can encourage these values. We need to take truth more seriously, and it's not good enough for people to dismiss science and hard science, because it doesn't fit with their philosophy. And this happens among scientists, and it happens among postmodernists. And both of them are eager to go, oh, well, it's not very convenient for us, so we're going to say it's not good science. That is not good science. We can't do without reason. You know, I'm passionate about reason. I've written thousands of pages of well-reasoned, I believe, argument. So I'm not saying that these things are not valuable, but I think we need to reconnect ourselves with things like great art, the natural world, and the spiritual realm, not cut ourselves off from them. And they can only be understood if you make the move towards them. They won't come and get you out of bed in your, in your left hemisphere apartment somewhere.
That was the fire I was looking for, Iain. Thank you. The movement towards the things that you described.
Yes, but I do want to say, yes, that, you know, what I have to say about the relationship between that sense of the sacred and religion is, I think I finesse it. I think I finesse all these things. And what really grieves me is that when I say something briefly for the purposes of something like this, I have to vulgarize, and people will sound like I'm trying to push a religion. I'm not.
I think you're among friends here. No, really, I think you're among friends.
No, and I'm not dismissing religions either. I think they play a very important role. And I talk about their virtues and vices. And I'm certainly not, you know, a card-holding member of anything particular, although I happen to think that the Christian mythos is enormously potent and incredibly moving, actually, and it deeply speaks to me, and so does Buddhism, and so do parts of the Vedanta and so on. So and all these traditions actually encompass far more than we now hold. And even of Christianity, there's a trend in early mysticism in Christianity which would understand all the chapters of part 3 of my book, even though they're about things that probably weren't much debated at the time.
Great. Well, listen, thank you for enduring my questions, and
thank you.
Another chance to talk again before long. I think, yes. Alex, I can pass it back to you and to the wonderful panel you've assembled.
Yes.
We'll take it from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you, Alex. Yes, I just want to say something briefly about, first of all, how grateful I am for the generous giving of their time of the experts we've gathered. There are 6 of them. I will introduce them extremely briefly. The first is Martin Rossor, Professor Emeritus at the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery, Queen Square in London, and the UCL Queen Square Institute of Neurology. David Lorimer, who is the Programme Director of the Scientific and Medical Network and co-founder of Character Education Scotland. Jürg Kesselring, who is Professor of Clinical Neurology and Neurohabilitation at the University of Bern and the Centre for Neuroscience in Zurich. Sharon Dirckx, former neuroscientist and brain imaging researcher at Cambridge, now senior tutor at the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. Mary Attwood, art historian, co-founder of the Centre for Myth, Cosmology and the Sacred, and co-founder and co-director, I'm pleased to say, of Channel McGilchrist, and Alex Gómez-Marín, who you have met, theoretical physicist turned behavioral neurobiologist, Ramon y Cajal Fellow and Principal Investigator of the Behavior of Organisms Laboratory at the Instituto de Neurociencias de Alicante. So those are our panel. And what I proposed to do was to go, relatively briefly to each of them in turn and to have a short discussion, and then to open it so that people can talk to one another across this group of people we've got gathered here. So Martin, if I may turn to you first, Martin Rossor, if we can bring picture forward. There we are. Martin, thank you very much for coming. Have you any reflections or any questions? I know you've read at least some of The Matter with Things.
Yes, it's difficult to know where to start. So, I mean, just a general comment, first of all, and there are various questions I have, which almost listening to the discussion today, almost better taken offline, I think. But I've read this, all of the books, as a layman, and as a clinical neurologist. That's not quite the same as a neuroscientist. I have been swept along by it. The wonderful metaphors, your vignettes, your illustrative narrative of concepts have just, they felt right to me. Some of it has been very powerful in terms of the patients I see, in the same way as I think it has for you. I almost feel now that with functional imaging, people forget all the work that Sperry did, and you interpret it so well, it's almost forgotten. And of course, cutting the callosum is rarely done now, so we don't see them. But I remember the first time I saw somebody with a intermanual conflict, and people will recall, you do describe this, where the right hand goes out to take something and the left hand comes across and stops it. And it's quite often on choices that are being made. And that was a great insight, having read, first of all, The Master and the Emissary. I mean, I was trained to think that the right hemisphere didn't do very much and was silent. Same sort of left hemisphere error that told me that most of the genetic material is meaningless and junk, a sort of classic thing. So I guess I have to admit I'm still reading it. I've told you that before. It's a year on. I read it all through, and I now want to make sure that my left hemisphere.
So we've lost your voice. I can't hear you. I can't hear you, Martin.
Did I get muted?
Oh, now you're back. No, you're back. Yes.
Is that okay? I think I was saying that I'm still reading it, and in much more detail. I'm
delighted that you're still reading it.
It's wonderful. I just want to make sure that my left hemisphere isn't being selective in some of the evidence.
Okay.
I'll report back in a year.
Okay. That's very nice. Yes, I think myself that not just Sperry, but also the general lesion literature, which is so rich and goes back to before 1900, largely in French and German, which I've brought into the book because I think it's important that people read it. I think it tells us every bit as much and more, actually, than neuroimaging, which is so hard to interpret. And I think that it's not an either or here. I think we need both. But I think I would be inclined to rely more on lesion literature. What's marvelous now is that we're able to inflict a lesion on somebody for 20 minutes or half an hour using TMS, and they're perfectly all right again when it wears off. At that time, we can investigate the deficits caused by either inhibiting or enhancing the underlying cortex. Well, thank you very much anyway. I wanted to bring in next David Lorimer. David, are you there? David, I can
I'm here.
neither see nor hear you.
Well, you should now be able to.
Oh, yes, brilliant. Lovely. Thank you. Yes.
Excellent. I have some short reflections and a question for you, Iain. I will try to put my composite review of your volumes into the chat, if I'm allowed to do that, so people can have a look at that. I have in those reviews, I said that you were the William James of our time, and I won't take that back. And I think that what you've done here is produce what you might call the varieties of hemispheric experience, but with a much wider application, because you look at the cultural consequences. And I think it's worth reflecting that the fact that you were able to spend 7 years at All Souls reading extremely widely informs and enabled, in a sense, your books and the extraordinary scope that they cover. And listeners won't be aware that you read Collingwood's essay on metaphysics when you were a scholar at Winchester at the age of 16. And I don't know that any 16-year-old would even open it, let alone understand it and read it. And I think the cultural significance of the book, and there's so many different aspects to it, but what really spoke to me was your Plotinus quote, "But we, who are we?" And of course, it runs all the way through the volume. And I see there are two trends happening at the same time. You might want to comment on this, although it's not actually my question. There's one which where increasing number of people are realizing there's something fundamental about consciousness and pervasive intelligence in the universe. And on the other hand, we've got a rapid Silicon Valley led progress towards transhumanism, which regards the human being as simply a biological machine, which is a view that you and I do not share. So that's sort of cultural observation. And my question, the starting point comes from a quote from Keynes, where he says, when we have a choice between changing our mind or proving that there's no need to, most people get busy with the proof. And I've observed this. I'm sure people on the call have observed it. That there is a reluctance to change your mind, especially when you've been trained to think in that way, and all your colleagues think in that way, and the cost of not thinking that way can be quite high.
Oh yes, yes.
And the point that I learned yesterday, and which I thought was worth bringing into this conversation, is that if you just present data, good data, scientific research, and so on, you might just increase the resistance and entrenchment, driven by the left hemisphere, I think. And so the recommendation from this person was that instead of presenting, data that can't be explained by that particular theoretical stance, you should ask questions instead. And so my question to you, in relation to your general hypothesis and consciousness in particular, is that if you were speaking to a hardened left hemisphere person, what questions would you ask to try and open the door?
Oh gosh, that is a very good question. I usually, when it's that kind of person, it's going to be fruitless whatever I say, but I think I would certainly begin by challenging the neuroscientific mainstream view that really the right hemisphere is not very important and so on. So, and if I were able to look at that, and they realize that actually there are things that have been widely believed that really need an enormous amount of revision and refinement, and that has some implications, I would try and ask them to consider that maybe there were implications of that led outside of science. But I actually find that quite a lot of people, you have a cross-purposes conversation because they're already playing the either-or game, and they're already doing the cut-and-dried game, and they're already doing the you can't have that and that game, which is actually where we're trying to get to, that those things are possible, and actually not only possible, but necessary for a vision here. So I think it's slightly like the rather melancholy aspect of being a doctor, which is that there are various you cannot help, but you can spend a lot of energy in helping those patients who can be helped. And I suppose my view is that that's what I'm doing, is that, if I may swap for patients, readers, that I'm reaching people, and I feel I am. And I can't help the fact that some people can't be helped, if you see what I mean.
No, I think that's a very good response. And I think I would also take them back to their own experience.
I think taking them back to experience and saying, well, what would you say about this? Would you say, but then you just say, oh, yes, it's just, I quoted in something that I did a couple of days ago. I do so many things these days, I can't keep up. But Daniel Dennett was asked by an Italian journalist, so do we have a soul? And he said, yes, much to everyone's surprise. And it's a lot of little tiny robots. And I would love to say to him, well, can I just have you in the psychiatrist's chair for a little while? And can we talk about some of the rather more moving things that have happened in your life? And let us test out these ideas you're putting forward and the ideas I'm putting forward. So I think, yes, getting people to re-examine their experience is good. And one final remark, because I think we better move on at this stage. On that business of speaking about panpsychism on the one hand and Google, Amazon and the AI potentates on the other. I'd just like to mention to people that I did give the opening address to the World Summit of AI in Amsterdam 2 weeks ago, and it's freely available on YouTube. It's only 25 minutes long, but I said a few things that I thought needed to be said and got surprisingly positive remarks from people in the field who said, you've really made us think. So
excellent. Well, do put that, somebody, maybe Mary could put that in the chat for us and we'll have a look. Thank you. Great to see you. Thank you.
Nice to see you, David, and very good to see you, Jürg. Thank you. I know that you've had to reorganize your very busy day around the possibility of being here. Jürg Kesselring, have you any thoughts, or I know you have a lot because you've written to me about them, but have you any points or questions you'd like to raise now?
Yes, can you hear me? Is it okay?
I can very clearly, yes.
Okay. As a clinical neurologist and working in neurorehabilitation mainly, the question is, because I've learned so much from your books, to address our patients differently, or I always had tried to see them as persons and not just as some robots or machines carrying a brain. But for a musician, it is important to find the metaphor of an instrument. For me as a cellist, I know that my music is not in the cello, but it requires my doing something. And how do I have access to my brain hemispheres? And I accept that you differentiate this polarity, which is in the world, to our two hemispheres. But what you called the spiritual or the wisdom tradition has for a long time talked about what you describe so beautifully and carefully as the right hemisphere functions as the heart. And we know now that it is anatomically probably not correct, that this one muscle here is taking a view on the world, and I accept well this differentiation of the two hemispheres, but I'm interested, how can we have the access, I as a person, access to my instrument, and what can I do when there is a damage on one side of the brain or another to improve the condition. So that is how I understand rehabilitation, and it is a function of the brain, and it is a function you have described in very much detail and beautifully, but the metaphor of the instrument and countering those people who say, well, you are the brain. How should we counter this attitude, which I feel personally, from my experience, is completely wrong? And one question for the consciousness is also always for me, what role has consciousness in our dreams? As during sleep, am I the same when I'm dreaming as I am during my more or less bright consciousness? I think I am the same person, and I'm also responsible for what is going on in the brain, but I have not such a direct access to my actions in the dreams as I have during life. Excuse me.
Yes. No, wonderful. Just a very brief remark at the outset. I do think that we now know that the heart is not just a pumping muscle, that it does play a part in our consciousness. And when I was in medical school, not only did I hear almost nothing about the right hemisphere or anything interesting about the asymmetries of the two hemispheres, but I also learned that there were afferent fibers from the heart that went back to the brain. And this was terribly embarrassing. Why were there so many of these fibers giving information to the brain rather than the brain giving information to the heart? And it was said they were probably C fibers, pain fibers, and some of them are, but there are more than that. And as I've sometimes remarked, there are more brains in our human gut, more neurons in our human gut than there are in the brain of a dog. So it's not just to do with peristalsis. What I love about your image about the instrument is that, of course, everything exists in an encounter. Your encounter with that instrument is where the music for the time is. And it's also in the encounter between, as I have been privileged to experience, between hearing you play your cello and my mind and my consciousness and my memories and so on. So there are ramifications of encounters that are reverberative and that change, that you change the instrument changes you. Your playing changes me, my listening to it may change you. So there is a constant need for the understanding that the relationships are of this kind. And I think that when it comes to the brain and the mind, that there is a very close relationship between them. And they could indeed be seen as aspects of something that is fundamentally ontology. We don't know enough to be able to answer that particular question. But the consciousness is not simply the brain. And one observation made by the 19th century Victorian philosopher F.C.S. Schiller is very interesting. And why is it, he says, that when somebody through an injury to the brain loses a certain faculty, sometimes after a while, another area of the brain is recruited to carry out this function. I mean, it's something you and I know only too well. And it's not enough discussed. Where is the information about the whole carried that causes this to happen? And it can be imaged also at the level of the single cell. So we now know that a single cell, another part of the cell can activate something that is needed somewhere else in the microorganism of that cell to set a process underway that is required for the survival of the whole cell. So this business of the parts and the whole knowing something and having information which is not just included in the mechanism is one worth talking about.
Mm-hmm. For me, it's also that I have an experience of myself as I was as a schoolboy. Although probably the physics of my body and brain has changed and has been replaced, but where has my feeling of my personality been in that time? That
is very good. And as we know from Wilder Penfield's experiments on the exposed cortex, that sometimes things that we didn't know, we'd forgotten, are still actually there and can be summoned up. So as Henri Bergson suggested, that memory is actually a filter that keeps out most of our past experience, allowing us only to access the things that are useful to us now. And one final remark, as you know, a slime mold can be trained to solve a maze in the way that rats can solve a maze. And if you cut off a bit of the slime mold, that little piece of the slime mold will remember how to solve the maze. Anyway, thank you very much, Jürg. Sharon Dirckx, I hope you're there. Sharon, thank you very much indeed for agreeing to come along and give a slightly different, I hope, perspective on what we've been talking about. Have you any reflections or questions or?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, Iain, congratulations on the 1-year anniversary of this book. And
thank you.
I very much enjoyed our conversation earlier in the year and enjoyed reading some of it. I haven't read all of it yet, but I have been particularly interested in...
That means there's more to come.
Yeah, exactly, to look forward to. And it's interesting, as I was listening to your conversation with Jonathan, and as Jonathan was kind of asking for you to kind of make the link between the different chapters, it occurred to me that in a sense you've written a book that embodies the concepts that you seek to explain, because it gradually kind of comes into being the more that you read. And again, I don't know if you intended to do that at the outset, but it seems to be that the work as a whole has embodied something of what you're trying to capture. And I, for one, am very grateful for your voice in this field, particularly, as you know, my interest is in the kind of philosophy of mind and how that merges with theological and neuroscientific observations and perspectives. And for such an influential voice to write something so holistic has been such a benefit to this whole field. Of course, the backdrop is that, you know, the neural correlate is the phenomena in its entirety, and of course we you know, recognize that that's certainly part of our understanding of any given phenomena, but it's not the whole thing. And so I was just so grateful for your authoritative and long kind of searching and research, putting forward a holistic view. I also really appreciated your emphasis on the role of imagination and intuition, and how these actually have a role in the sciences as well. And we've lost some of that. We need to recover the role of imagination and intuition, and acknowledge that actually some very significant progress has been made using these faculties. So I really appreciated that as well. And of course, your three perspectives: the brain emits consciousness, the brain transmits consciousness, and the brain permits consciousness, I found to be a helpful a set of distinctions, and I know you would adhere more to the third of those things. And I think the main area that we disagreed, or perhaps just had different perspectives, is in the nature of the divine and how that ties into how we think about consciousness. And I suppose my question to you is, what is your current thinking on how to account for the inordinately different levels of consciousness that we see in humans compared with the rest of the animal world, and how you see that fitting with a panentheistic view of God, as opposed to, say, a Trinitarian view, or other kind of Eastern views as well?
Well, I hope that they're not entirely in conflict with one another. Maybe my lack of training in theology, but it seems to me that there's more in common between these positions. As I said, Moltmann shows that panentheism and Trinitarianism actually work hand in hand, and I find myself enormously sympathetic to Buddhism. I feel like Molière's Monsieur Jourdain, who discovered that he'd been speaking prose all his life without knowing it. When I meet Buddhists, I discover I've been a Buddhist all my life without knowing it. But you talk about the different levels. I didn't know whether you were talking about the different levels of consciousness that can be experienced by a human being, or whether you were talking about the different levels of consciousness as one looks through the animal world and the inanimate world, indeed, if panpsychism is true. I think it was probably that one that you were talking about. And I suppose the way I look at the evolution of the cosmos, if I were to put it from a Christian point of view, the case I would make is that Christians believe that God is love. And indeed, this is, again, absolutely one with many other world religions. Love is a relationship. And love is a relationship that requires, therefore, an other that is responsive. And that other must be free either to respond or not to respond. Otherwise, it isn't a relationship. It's just a matter of an extension of the power of the first party. So what the world shows is an evolution of this other. And one of the ways of explaining life to me is that it enormously accelerates the business of responsiveness. So there is a sense in which I would argue that even the inanimate world actually does respond to the forces of nature and so on, but it does so extremely slowly and in a very, very limited way to really simple push and pull you phenomena. But that with life, there comes the possibility of vastly more rapid, billions of times more rapid development and an increase in the range of things that can be responded to. And Whitehead makes the good point that why, if evolution is all about improving survival, why have we bothered with things like human beings who live for a puny 70 years when there are actinobacteria at the bottom of the ocean, which not only have survived as a species very nicely for billions of years, thank you very much, but single examples of which may be over 1 million years old. So they beat us hands down and everything else for longevity and survival. But I think there's much more that's at stake here, and this is where the chapter that we didn't get round to talking about purpose and direction, because I don't believe that things in the universe have no direction. I think you have to perform enormous feats of explaining away, as Whitehead said, if you really believe that. Or you have to invent, well, there just are millions of universes or perhaps an infinite number so that everything can happen. Well, yeah, that cuts the floor under science and reason, in my view. So what I would say in answer, sorry, I'm trying to come to your point, is that our consciousness is more able to respond than other creatures. I think other creatures, we don't know because we can't get inside them, but they clearly do respond to beauty. And many animals actually have a sense of fellowship, will sacrifice themselves to save another, not even another of the same species. They feel things that other creatures feel, even quite simple animals. So they have at least part of what we would call goodness and a sense of beauty and their own kind of truth. And I think that we are more capable of a greater range and a greater intensity of response. And it's that response in the encounter with the divine that is the important thing. Does that sound okay?
It's definitely the sort of thing that I was interested in. I suppose the limitation is the capacity to respond verbally in order to verify conscious awareness.
Yes.
I think the point about love that you mentioned earlier, I remember we were discussing that in our conversation as well, and I think one thing that I was thinking about in terms of a panentheistic view is that if the coming into being of the divine and of the kind of person are linked, then is love that something that comes about by necessity rather than by kind of choice, because these two things are connected. And I guess in my mind that is distinct from a Trinitarian perspective, which would say that love was kind of present and relationality was present before there was anything material in Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and so that provides a context for the creating of a material world out of choice, which just changes the kind of the set of assumptions and underlining the particular cosmos that we find ourselves in. So that would be something that I've been thinking about.
Well, thank you, and no doubt one day we'll have time to talk about it more. I mean, all I would really say is I resonated with everything you said. I didn't feel that I wanted to qualify or differ from you on any of that. So
yeah,
there we are.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mary Attwood, are you there?
I am, indeed. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, and I can now see you. Yes.
Good. Thank you, Iain, and it's wonderful to be here this evening and to celebrate the Matter with Things' first birthday. So I just wanted to reflect, first of all, on a particular myth that you brought out in volume 1 of The Matter with Things, and followed by a question which is loosely related to that myth. And I think it's interesting from what Jonathan was saying earlier and some of the other speakers that, you know, when we're grappling with concepts in particular, myth, imagination, and the image have a way of sort of reanimating our experience of the world. And it's very easy to stay stuck in concepts or conceptualization of these extraordinary scope of ideas and experience that you present in the book. And I feel today we're so much in the state where we're under a very reductionist viewpoint, where these beautiful and often very difficult ways to truth, as you lay out in volume 1, on as concepts rather than an experiential process, which you describe as a process of becoming. So I'd just like to reflect on a myth in a book that you describe and talk about. And as you say, all great myths both have a personal and a broader, overarching, timeless meaning, that they're not mere stories just to entertain, but they really are a reality of sorts and speak of deeper truths through image and metaphor in ways that rationality can't. And in volume 1, in chapter 15, you talk about the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice as holding a deep meaning, relevant, as you say, to one thread that winds its way through the entire book. And I'll just briefly talk about the myth for those of the listening who don't know about it. But the demigod Orpheus loved a nymph called Eurydice. They fall in love, they marry, and after their marriage, Eurydice is walking and she happens to be bitten by a viper and dies. Orpheus, whose realm was the musical, went into the underworld to summon the presence of the gods to rescue her. And he sang to convince them that he could do so, and moved them so much, and they finally agreed that he could go and rescue Eurydice, but with the condition that he mustn't look at her directly while he was leading her out of the underworld, while she's still in her phantom state. But just as they're about to step out of the mouth of the cave, he turns to look at her because he can't contain himself any longer and he wants to see her. And at that moment, she vanishes, never to be seen again. And you state, after describing that myth much more beautifully than I can, that it tells us of the personal, of loss, love, suffering, the journeys through the underworld that we have to go through. But you also say that it is an account of the nature of myth itself. And you then quote C.S. Lewis, who describes it as a reality, this beautiful myth. And then you end with this quote, and I'm quoting directly now from your book. And you say, it makes us feel as nothing else could do, the dangers of explicitness, and therefore the value of obliqueness, of myth, intuition, poetry, music, and all the other arts, true philosophy, true spiritual understanding, and every imaginative act whose aim is to offer a glimpse of the elusive nature of reality, not to mention the power of all that body of tacit knowledge without which we begin to lose life. And you then go on to say, it warns of the problematic tendencies of the left hemisphere. If you don't know why, I cannot help you, because if I attempted to grasp its meaning any more firmly and drag it into the light, it would vanish and die. So for me, I mean, as we're reflecting on the matter of things, I mean, I've read your book in its entirety, and that particular myth is in volume 1, and it's had a resounding presence, I think, for me throughout the entire book, that when I've grappled with certain concepts, and I'm not a physicist, I don't have a scientific background, I have an art historical background and a humanities background, there's something about this particular myth and the way you describe it, which has a great meaning personally to me. So I just wanted to reflect on that and just to bring that into everybody's awareness who perhaps hasn't encountered that in your book. And as somebody who's very interested in the ideas of what it means to see and our sense of vision, of knowing and not knowing, you know, can we see too much? Do we oversee, or do we not see enough? I just wondered, in light of that, very loosely, or perhaps sort of grasping too much in an explicit way, reflecting on the matter with things, having been in the world for a year. When The Master and His Emissary was published well over a decade ago, there was some sort of commonplace, overly explicit or reductionist misinterpretations that arose from its great depths. One of them being still that resounds today, that the right hemisphere was the sort of creative, fluffy one, that it came across as irresponsible or irrational. And I wonder, just from your point of view, a year on since The Matter of Things has been in the world, what have been the commonplace misinterpretations that have arisen so far from this book, the tendencies of others to make its subtle beauty perhaps overly explicit and therefore lose its meaning?
Okay, well, thank you very much. Yes. It seems to me that in the modern world, this desire to make everything explicit is actually destroying the possibility of contacting everything that is of value. And so I hold that myth to be the myth of all myths. In fact, it discloses the nature of myth itself. What are the ways in which that gets misunderstood? Well, I find I still, unbelievably, 12 years later from the publication of, or even longer actually, from the Master's Emissary, I'm still having to fend off people who say, "Oh, well, the hemisphere thing's all been exploded. It's not true," you know, and then they say the left hemisphere is all just rational and logical and linguistic, and the right hemisphere, etc., etc. So those are things that I have to fend off. But more subtly, I find.
Is Iain frozen?
Yeah, it seems to be.
Not exclusively, but that's it. And I wouldn't expect it to be exclusively. But there are certain constituencies of people, particularly those who are perhaps part of the mechanistic, philosophical or mechanistic scientific world, who have misunderstood what I'm saying. I mean, they simply haven't paid attention to what I'm saying. They've thought that I'm saying something because I must be saying either this or that. But I'm actually asking them to see that once you abandon that, you can see something deeper and more powerful. Now, some people have a gift of being able to go to what I'm saying very quickly. Some people can't. They're too bound up already with categories and systems that they already are completely wedded to. And so that's one way in which it can be difficult to get through to people. I've commented on that earlier this evening. But fortunately, so far, I can't complain about the way in which it's been received. Thank you.
Thank you, Iain.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Yeah. I do think that point about the implicit is very important. It's been important to me all my life. It's why I left the study of literature and the teaching of literature, because it seemed to me to reduce something that was necessarily implicit, like humor, that once it's explained, it no longer is there. And it turned the unique into the categorical, and it turned the general, you know, the unique into the general, and the embodied into the abstract. And these were all, as I discovered, tendencies of the left hemisphere, hence the 30 years I've spent working on this since. Anyway, thank you very much, Mary. Yep.
Thanks.
And finally, Alex, you spend much too much of your life talking to me, except I hope that people think that the time is not wasted. Those who don't get the reference, Alex and I have been working through, and have almost finished working through, the entire book, one chapter at a time, and often spending at least an hour and a half on each chapter. And it's been a wonderful experience for me. So thank you for being here tonight, Alex.
Yes, hello, Iain, and congratulations again. As you just said, I've had the luxury to navigate through The Matter with Things twice. Once when I read it and the second time in conversation form. And this brought to me some really, really unexpected surprises. And I wanted to quote something you said at the end of the chapter on matter and consciousness, which is not out yet. And so towards the very end of the chapter, you quote Stuart Sutherland, who wrote, referring to consciousness, that nothing worth reading has been written on it. And you add to it, in a very ingenious way, well, I cannot hope to have been an exception to this rule. And so I asked you to say more about this as we were discussing chapter 25 on matter and consciousness. And you said something that when you finished and when we finished the recording, I went back to the tape, let's say, and transcribed what you said, because I thought it was wonderful. And I wanted to share it and then make my question and a reflection. Okay. So you said, all we can do with any of these things, and you're talking about consciousness, but also about the sense of the sacred and so on. All we can do with any of these things is to adopt the view that we can just have a try to do something that cannot really be done. And the attempt to do it is better than the sort of refusal to even try. And then you added, nothing could be said on this topic without it being easy to fold, but to say nothing would have been a greater betrayal than to say what I could say edged round in various ways. All right, so you've said perhaps what cannot be said, and so it has been said, and it has been read, it has been heard, perhaps by some of your viewers. But now I'm wondering, and here I'll read you one brief passage again. This is the last paragraph of the epilogue of the book. And so you said, I have said what I can. If you wish more, I can do no better than repeat the words of the 17th century priest and physician, Angelus Silesius. And that's what he said. Friend, that is surely enough. And should you want to read more, then go and become yourself the words and yourself the being. Okay, so some may hope that what you've written can, in a way, heal or change the world. But of course, it first must change ourselves. So as I was reading this, I remembered of the famous phrase that the words became flesh. So my question to you is, since you've midwifed, and I like to use this word, you've midwifed this creation, how has the book changed you? And since this is a rather unfair question, I'll give you like two options to answer. One is personally, especially throughout the 10 years of gestation of these two creatures. The second part could be, especially during this last year, how have you seen the landscape, the figure, the nature of the so-called public intellectual? So you can go either way.
Gosh. Well, thank you, Alex. I think obviously there are certain things that are better not said, but if we say nothing about them, they disappear from public discourse, and so they are no longer part of what we see or think or talk about. And it's quite true that, as Lao Tzu said, he who knows does not tell, he who tells does not know. So it's an awkward one. I would say it's been an immense struggle. I'm a bit of a physical coward. I think I'd spill all if they started putting the thumb screws on. But I think I do have a certain degree of intellectual and moral courage. I think I know myself well enough now to be able to say that. And if you like, the evidence is in having stood firm, said things that people told me don't even try, etc. And I'm, bloodied but unbowed, to quote the poem Invictus, which ends with the words, I am the captain of my fate, I am the something of my fate, I am the captain of my soul. So I feel that it has been it's been bruising. It's been incredibly hard. At times I have despaired. At times I really felt I would never be able to recover from the despair. I mean, those of you who have looked at the film clip that I think has been put up of the first of this 8th of November last year, when people gathered together kindly to launch the book, don't know that actually at lunch that day I was with my brother, and it was all I could do to stop insisting that actually the only thing for me was suicide. And I remember gripping his arm in the restaurant and just saying, I need to hold on to you. And I felt completely devastated by the business of writing this book. People are surprised when I say I hate writing. I do hate writing. However, I love having written. So it may be something I can never know, but it may be something like the experience of giving birth, midwifing, as you say, I do use that expression, into the world, except that not the midwife, but the parent, the mother. And so I watched with some trepidation, the progress of these twins, but they seem to be doing fine. And I feel that the whole business, that I always think it's such a mystery when I look back on my life, the things that have been really, really painful and terrible, and I'm sure we've all had them in our lives. The whole thing has some sort of meaning for me, nonetheless, and I, in a strange way, wouldn't be without them. That sounds contradictory, but then all the important truths are. So there we are. And I think the plight of the public intellectual these days is that saying these difficult things is not honoured. People are far too hidebound in the ways in which they think. We get all this really utterly ghastly, mindless yabber on social media in which people just shout at one another, so sure that they are right and the other person must be wrong. We need, for God's sake, to have dialogue. We need to have encounters. We need to have empathy. We need to have togetherness. It's all in relation. This is the theme of my book. But also part of my book is that opposition, resistance is part of creation. So there we are. That's all I can really say, Alex, but thank you.
It's a lot. Gracias, Iain.
De nada. So at this point, I think have we got 5 minutes? Or we started 5 minutes late. So if we go on to say 7:50 and then have 15 minutes of questions from the chat, is that all right?
Perfect.
Shall we do that? Or if we find that actually the experts don't want to talk, then we can just go to questions from the chat. I'm easy. I'm leaving this now with you again, Alex.
Well, let's go ahead, and perhaps anyone from the panelists, including Jonathan, who wishes to add something, now is the moment. Please.
If I'm on, yeah, just briefly, and just because I was there on November the 8th, so I'm very thunderstruck by that comment. I was aware that you're under a huge amount of pressure, and that really brings it home. And if I have a regret from that evening, which I think otherwise I don't have many, but if I had a regret, there was a moment when I was speaking, I wish we'd had a moment of kind of silence to just empathize with your predicament over those 10 years on the Isle of Skye, writing and unwriting, editing, crossing out, finding footnotes, tracing papers, deleting, as every good writer knows, it's mostly about deleting, crafting again and again, wondering about the structure, wondering if one thing follows from another, wondering what such and such will say about it. The kind of, you mentioned you hate it, and I know there's a kind of exquisite hatred there rather than a just abject hatred, but still there was something about wanting to have said that people should just feel into what it's like to take 10 years to create this book and to sacrifice a decade of your life to give this gift to all of us. And what I hope for them was the room would just be silent to imagine, and those of you who've seen your home in Skye can maybe make it even more vivid, that this is really a beautiful but very remote place. And this book was brought into being in that beautiful remote place when Iain was almost entirely alone with his thoughts and his words. And I can see why he would have despaired, because it's such a monumental achievement. But to get there, there would have been so many moments of darkness when it would have seemed impossible to get to the other side. So I guess I want to say thank you, but also to encourage the audience here assembled tonight, and we have a great turnout, just to take a second of silence to think of that experience. So if you don't mind, 30 seconds. And then coming back into the room, I'm not sure if that was a full 30, but as Iain says, time flows. It's not always easy to get it just right. I just wanted to just capture that awareness of the writer at work, the sort of sacred suffering that 10-year process of scholarly commitment in order to give oneself to the world in that way. I just wanted to sort of draw attention to those moments where you were alone with your thoughts and your words, which are now in the world. That was all. Yeah.
But can I say thank you? But also these words don't sit easily with me. Thank you for saying them. But I'm not sure. But there we are. I can't say that it wasn't exquisitely painful. And one of the things is that I like to write in a way that I hope will flow easily for the reader and neither patronize them nor make assumptions of knowledge that they might not have. And that's why it's a long and painful process. Anyway, enough about all that. And let's have some questions or some comments, or wherever you want to take it, Alex. I'm with you.
I'll invite again anybody from the panel.
I've just got a small snippet to contribute. When you were talking about asymmetry and symmetry, and asymmetry being able to include symmetry, but not the other way around, somehow it reminded me of the role of dissonance in Bach, which Iain will be very familiar with. And there's a kind of exquisite pain in the dissonance, which is then resolved by the harmony or by the development of the let's say the fugue. And I can think of many examples of this. And I experienced that as subtly painful, but wonderfully resolving when you get to the next bar.
Beautifully said, David, and it's something I do comment on and refer to too, but he's wonderful. Thank you. I mean, he's the master of that.
Iain, I mean, this is a comment, and it's stating the obvious, but just looking at all the messages and reflecting on how it's been for me reading this book, like great works, it changes how you view the world, and that stays with you for the rest of your life. And I think it's just worth restating that. It's implicit in all of these messages, and thank you for that.
Oh, Martin, thank you very much for saying that. That is what I hope for. That is all I hope for. And I do get people writing to me, and I don't want them not to, because it keeps me going. It's what makes me want to carry on, is that people write and say, this has changed my life. I can't see the world the same way again. And that's all I wanted. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Iain.
If you say it was difficult to write the book, it's clear it was difficult to do it physically. And so, but you always must be aware that it is a gift you present to us. And here we are 500 such and such, but there are thousands around. And to be somebody who gives must be satisfying. It cannot be otherwise. And you made such a great gift to so many of us, and we are grateful, and you must know that.
Thank you. It's when people say these things that I know it. But I have that tendency that quite a lot of people have, not really to believe that there's anything in it until somebody says it. So I need to work on myself. Physician, heal thyself, I hear. And I have tried over a lifetime to try to heal myself of this tendency to believe I'm a total imposter. But there we are.
Maybe if I just wanted to also add that, I mean, you know, this work is being referred to as something that people will be reading for many, many years to come as well, not just the people that are reading it at the moment, but many decades from now, this will still be being referred to. And so it's an investment in future generations as well as in the current.
Well, thank you.
Mm.
That's very wonderful. I'm embarrassed that it's turned into, instead of people cross-examining me, they're sending me the most beautiful smelling bouquets. But thank you very, very much. I'm genuinely grateful to you for doing so. Thank you.
Let me add let me add one more comment, if I may.
Yes.
Top it on this. There's something, maybe it's not an exaggeration to say there's something mantric about the book. It is so long, and usually mantras are short phrases that are repeated, but
yes,
going through page and page and page for thousands of pages, or maybe hundreds of pages, I could feel that there's something about you, Iain, your temperament, of course your wisdom, but also something personal that slowly pours down. And it's very beautiful to feel it when you're reading, and it's an exceptional thing to happen when you're reading a book, that there's this kind of motion in the way you place the words that feels like a mantra. So that's I wanted to add.
Wonderful, serious. Thank you. Thank you.
May I ask a question?
Yes, I think so. Alex is the chairman of this, so.
Yes, so if the panel if you're finished with your comments, then we'll move to the Q&A. And as I remarked at the beginning, I see so many hands raised on Zoom, but we said at the beginning that I'll be, and I have been collecting questions from the chat throughout this call. So I'm going to read a few that I've collected. Those who raised your hand, in the meantime, please write it on the chat, and let's see how many we can get through. Unfortunately, it's going to be perhaps 3 or 4 to be on time, maybe 5. And as a reminder, you can always become a member of Channel McGilchrist, and there's room to ask many, many questions to Iain. So I'll start with the first one that I've selected here. Iain, this is kind of a classic one, but I think we need to go over and over. So Ben Reddick asks, or says, my servant seems to have locked the master in the broom cupboard and barricaded the door. What can the master do to redress the imbalance?
That is a very good one. I mean, obviously, if you're literally locked in a broom cupboard, your only way is to force the lock. But I think we can leave the metaphor and say, what can we do to try and redress the balance? And I think it's in things that I may have commented on during the course of the evening, that we need to nourish our ability not to know and not to jump into doing things. This is wisdom, which is both Oriental and in Meister Eckhart. And it's part of this process of, the not seeing of Eurydice by Orpheus. So we need to cultivate a frame of mind in which we are in awe before things, not cleverly thinking we understand them all now. Cultivate our understanding of their beauty and complexity, both of the inanimate cosmos and the animate one. I mean, I ought to mention that I'm reading ahead of publication Jude Currivan's latest book. She's a physicist. You may know her book, The Holographic Universe, which I very much liked. But her description of the extraordinary way in which the universe evolved, and so purposefully, as far as one can see, towards an end. And the sheer awe-inspiring nature of that is very important. So I think the three great things in life are compassion, awe, and a sense of togetherness and humility. Before, if there's one thing wrong with us, it's hubris. It's those people who say, oh, we now understand it all. It's all little robots. My soul, it's just little robots. Well, when people say things like that, you really know that the clock has struck 13 and it's time that we start thinking in a different way. So I hope that will happen.
Yes, thank you, Iain. Let's go for another one. So James Van Leeuwen asks or says, listening and wondering how to make a discourse like this far more public and accessible, especially for youth. I'm sure I'm not the only participant noticing the demography of this audience.
Noticing the
demographics.
Oh, I see. Okay. Wonderful. One of the things that very, very much pleases me is that when I go and talk in public, that a lot of people are young, and they come up to me afterwards and say, this is amazing. Why did I not know this? And what can we do? So the motivation is there, I think. People need to be let out of the broom cupboard. They need to be let out of the prison of the mind they've been put into, and are being put into at the moment by their teachers who don't understand that science and maths are actually wonderful, fascinating, imaginative and beautiful exercises. This is borne out by the history of science and maths over and over again, and it's all in my book. So we need a radical shake-up here, and I'm very pleased if there's some way that people can suggest to make this more public. I mean, it's a free event now. This can be put online. If you can send links to it once it goes up to people that you know, to teachers, to friends, and simply push the word around, I think that will do as much good as anything that anybody can do, really. I'm very, pleased and honored that you think that it's worth that. But if you do think it's worth that, that's what we should be doing. And certainly we'll put it up, of course, in a small way on Channel McGilchrist. You'll put it up on the Pari Center website. And but there are moves to rethink the way in which people treat education. So I'm actually involved in giving a series of lectures to something called the Peterson Academy. I haven't done them yet, but I propose to do that, which will be a way in which people can get access to lectures without having to mortgage themselves to the hilt in order to be able to go to university and get perhaps nothing particularly nourishing out of it. So that's what we're hoping for. Anyway, there we go.
Fantastic. So we'll have two more questions, if you may.
I'm happy to go on longer if other people are. I mean, I can go on till, say, 10 past, but 10 past I have to stop. But if other people want to leave, you didn't sign up to come here forever, please feel free to go, and we won't be taking names.
All right. So the following one could be seen as a follow-up of the previous one. Oliver, and sorry for the surname pronunciation, Should-Face, says, I can't escape the impression that there is a political dimension to Iain's work. Certainly, when I look around me and notice what's happening in Ukraine, in the US, in China, countries that have succumbed at the political level to an impoverished left hemisphere style view of citizens and the world. So I'm wondering, what's Iain's take on the political dimension of his work? Because it's clearly there in an emergent way.
Thank you. Is that actually Oliver Schultheis,
yes,
German psychology lecturer? Yes. Oh, thank you, Oliver. Thank you very much. Are you there? I'd love to see you. Anyway, I'm here. As I quote your work. Right, okay.
Thank you.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. There is, but I don't... rather like the things that have to remain more implicit, I don't make a big deal out of it because I don't want suddenly to become, oh, he's got a political point to make. I mean, of course, if you've got to make a point about philosophy and about the nature of the human being, it will have political ramifications. And my work has political ramifications. And I tend to touch on them rather lightly but I'm told that people can see what is being talked about without my needing to take a mallet and a tent peg to their temples. So that's the way I'd put it. I hope it has political meaning, because otherwise things won't change. But I hope that people will see that themselves and make the connections themselves, rather than me appearing to be hectoring people about politics. It's very easy these days to get put into a certain little box, and once you're there, all the richness of the matter with things will become simply part of a political argument, which it isn't at all.
I see Jonathan wishing to say something. Yes.
Yeah, just briefly, Alex. Thank you. Just as Iain knows, I've tried over the years, and I've been an interpreter of Iain's work for a good decade now. This question comes up in different forms about the politics of Iain's work. One way I think is helpful to think about it, although it's a little jargony, is that it's not so much political as meta-political. It's about it's about looking inside what politics is and recasting what politics should be about. Clearly, there's a relationship between the left hemisphere and power, for example, and clearly there's a sort of vision of the world presented by the right, that is, by the right here, I mean the right hemisphere, not the right wing, that would, when you look through those lenses, the whole idea of the political spectrum should dissolve. A new set of priorities should come into being. If the cosmos is, as Iain describes it, particularly in the second volume, politics as we know it changes fundamentally. So it's not as though the thesis says, therefore vote this way or that way, or therefore prioritize economic growth or prioritize something else. It's more that it recasts your very idea of what political practice should look like, because it reprioritizes the sacred, reprioritizes education, reprioritizes imagination, and so forth. And through that, a different kind of politics should arise.
Thank you, Jonathan. That's what I would have liked to have said, but I couldn't have said it so eloquently and briefly.
All right. So let's go for a different one, which I'm sure you've answered before, but I feel like bringing it in. Joe Pratt asks, could you please talk about the cover of your book, the painting that appears behind you sometimes? Thank you.
Okay. Yes, of course I can. There are two paintings that occupy a very interesting position somewhere between natural landscape and the other is the realm of the wholly abstract. So they are abstract paintings that also convey a sense of a place, which seems to me an extraordinary thing to have achieved. My first experience was of a sort of Wahrnehmung in front of them. I saw them and I knew that they were great. I knew they were important. I saw them in a gallery. And one of them is in this room here where I am, and I just decided to reorientate myself tonight. But the other one is too far away to be able to show you at the moment. It's just in another room on the ground floor. And I love these paintings, and they're by Ross Loveday. I discovered that actually the king, as he now is, had been I didn't know this, but he'd been very attracted to them and has bought paintings of his. I did an internet conversation with Nina Kraus at Northwestern University, a neuroscientist who's written a wonderful book on sound and the nature of hearing called Of Sound Mind. And at the end, she showed me that because of my interest, she had actually bought a Ross Loveday painting and had it on the wall, which I thought was another wonderful sort of connection of the right kind to make. Two scientists talking about the science and this picture. So what I like about them is that they have a different palette, each from the other. One of them has this rather vivifying picture of a sort of windswept landscape with this almost like iron ore in the landscape. And the other has this heap of sort of, as it were, smouldering things that are coming out of the ground that has some richness of gold and so on. But in some ways, it's like a fire burning. And to that extent, it reminds me of, I don't know how many of you have seen, but if you haven't, you must see it tomorrow, the film by Tarkovsky, Andrei Rublev. But at the end of Andrei Rublev, there is this amazing scene of a I won't go into the whole story, I haven't got time, but it's absolutely soul-searing, of this child who has done the most amazing thing but doesn't know how. And that actually feels to me like he didn't know the secret of bell making, but he had to pretend he did and command people to do this and make the bell, and at the end the bell works. And he breaks down afterwards and just sobs and lies in the mud, and there's this fire where the sort of smoke is just going up. And sometimes I feel like that child. I feel like I didn't know the secret, and yet somehow something came into being. That's the way I feel about it. Sorry, that sounds pretentious, but I can't help it. It's real. Anyway, there we go. That's all I can say. But Ross Loveday, great man.
Very good.
He's very pleased that I put them on the cover. He's delighted, so that's good.
Yeah. Okay, let me ask you another one. Actually, these come from two different people, but could be merged together. So Joseph asks, would you mind telling us about other thinkers from around the world with similar views to yours? And Mark Reed asks, Iain, who do you think is the most important thinker, philosopher, scientist that you have ever read and recommend us to read? An impossible question to answer, I know, but
yes,
I want to know about current fellows.
Ooh. Gosh, so many people have been an influence on me. The first question sounded as though it didn't actually specify somebody right now, but if it is somebody right now, it's more difficult. I can find people in the past who I've learned from and who I find, and some who I came to later, not having formed my thinking along their lines, but finding that they had already said many of the things I was struggling to say. In the world now, I know that there are people, but I can't really, and I have talked with some of them and will talk with others in the future, but it probably seemed a bit invidious to single out particular people and so on. But I mean, in the course of history, there are so many people who have been important to me. I mean, many poets, and of course, obvious people like Shakespeare and so on, but and Montaigne. But in science, William James is probably the most important figure in the history of science that I've read that has been utterly formative. There are people like Lichtenberg. Was he really a scientist or was he a philosopher? But it's usually scientists, philosophers who have the really interesting things to say. And people like Bergson, who was a scientist and a philosopher. It's ironic that he's often thought of as anti-scientific. There's probably no philosopher of the era in which he lived who was more involved with science and maths than Bergson. And of course, he was not at all anti-scientific. But these are the sort of people that I've been very much conversing with in my head over the last 10 years, at any rate. And what was the other question? Or was it the same question?
Well, so it was about current thinkers and also about thinkers that have marked you the most. So you've answered that one. Yes.
Yes, I think I have. I mean, it becomes insidious. I mean, the pre-Socratic philosophers, above all Heraclitus, have been accompanying me all my life. The Taoist tradition, as interpreted by Alan Watts, because I can't speak Chinese, has been extremely influential for me. I don't know. I have actually compiled a list somewhere, which I gave to members of the channel, of about 20 or 30 books. If you join the channel, you can see that, and I will also be better at trying to, now that I have passed this milestone, at putting up things that interest me that people might not know from both painting, architecture, poetry, and music on my website.
And just to mention that when you think you finish the book reading the epilogue, there's still appendices, and then there are like 200 double column pages of references. So if people are interested to know your sources, they have, I don't know how many.
Yes. Yes, I haven't listed anything that is not referred to in the book. I mean, it's only the ones that are referred to and have been properly consulted. Sorry, what were you saying, Jonathan?
Just that the appendices are good. There are sort of, it's a bit of a guilty pleasure after reading the whole book and the footnotes to think, oh my God, there's more. But I can avow that I read them and that there's they're quite significant, especially for more scholarly inclined, to make the case for some key parts of the argument with some depth and acuity. So recommended.
Yes. Thank you. They were bits that I felt might derail the flow of the chapter for non-specialists, but were there for those who are interested in the specialist stuff. Yeah.
Iain, do we have time for one more?
I think one more, and then that's it. Sadly, been a lovely party. Thank you.
A glass of wine, I think, might be required after this.
A glass of wine definitely required. I have an empty glass. I'm going to turn it down.
We can cheer at the end, yes. All right, so Isabella Granik says, I can imagine that artists, writers, and other creative people feel moved and vindicated by the messages of your books. What I'd like to know is whether there are scientists, apart from neurologists, who have talked to you about the impact of your work on their own. For example, I can imagine internalizing your work would radically change social psychologists and how they change their minds dramatically about how they see rational decision-making, or scientists studying cultural evolution. Any scientists express the impact of your work on theirs?
Definitely, and in that category, I think I'm not misrepresenting Oliver Schultheis, who is a social psychologist. But yes, I have found, I mean, a lot of people have written to me from the world of psychology, psychiatry, and neurology. What I have been very pleased by and a little surprised by is the number of physicists who have written to me. And it seems that in a way, as Niels Bohr himself said, the only way to talk about physics now is as the only way is to talk about the sacred, is through metaphors, through poetic images and so forth. And so although I'm not a physicist, and I don't have the right mind for being a physicist, I have tried to grapple with physics. I particularly have tried to get into an understanding of quantum field theory, which I find very exciting. And I've read various physicists, particularly David Tong has been influential on me, the professor of physics at Cambridge. But there are many others. I list them in the book. And that is very, very nice. I find that physicists are very approachable, non-stuffy, if I may put it this way, humble people, compared with many of the life scientists that I know. And it's possibly because the life scientists still think there are certainties and dogmas and they're right, but physicists have to know from the word go that it's complicated, there are no certainties, and whatever one says is going to have to be modified or qualified at some point in the future. So there we are. Thank you very much. And okay, I'm very glad to say that, you know, artists and writers do, you know, who are not scientists also like what I have to say. Thank you, if I may just say so. Thank you, Eleanor and James from the Pari Center. Thank you, David, from the Scientific and Medical Network. Thank you very much, Jonathan from Perspectiva, for being here. Thank you, Lance from ACDC, the Arthur Conan Doyle Center, for both publicizing this event and helping it to happen. So, and it was a big surprise that this was going to happen at all, and it's happened very quickly. So thank you to everybody for being game and willing to be part of it.
Before we close, we have a special announcement, Mary, if you may.
Oh, yes,
just
yes,
very
we do.
Briefly, we got carried away with the birthday celebrations, but the icing on the cake is that as a special present to the audience and members and everybody who comes to Iain's website, Channel McGilchrist, we're reducing the price of his book, The Matter with Things, for a limited period of 10 days. So the current Amazon price is £94.37. And on Iain's website, and I've just put the link in the chat, it's being reduced to £69.99 until the 20th of November. So it's just a little over, 10 days. So, but unfortunately, because the cost of couriering the copies of a 2-volume book weighing 3.5 kilos outside of the UK are prohibitive, the offer is only open to those with an address in the UK. And if you go to his website, and I've put the link in the chat, you can order it for a much reduced price. So it's a special thank you, a Christmas present really, from Iain, to say thank you. So you can take advantage of that for a few days.
Very good. All right. So thank you, Iain. Thank you to the rest of the panelists, and thank you to the more than 500 people that have joined us, and also to the Pari Center team behind the scenes, making sure everything runs well. So I just want to add, Iain, may your words help us heal the world and ourselves. So thank you very much.
Yes.
Indeed.
Thank you. Thank you. Be yourself the words and be yourself the being. Yes, the becoming. Thank you.